Welcome! This video is going to be all about Sonata Form. In the Sonata Form you find three different sections: the exposition, the development, and the recapitulation. This all exists in one movement, whether that is the entire piece or just a movement in a piece. This is Sonata Form. One of the most common areas where Sonata Form is going to be used is in a sonata. A sonata is typically a 3 to 4 movement piece, and almost always movement 1 of a sonata is in sonata form. Sometimes the other movements in the sonata are in sonata form as well, but oftentimes they are in different forms like ternary form, rondo form, and more. So the first section we have the exposition. This presents or exposes all of the main themes and the musical ideas to be used as foundations. Typically, this is two groups which are in contrasting keys with each other, with other contrasts in the themes, ideas, and moods as well. But the main thing is that they are in contrasting keys. This sets up a conflict of tonality, along with the other contrasting elements if they're used. The entire exposition is often repeated. This is something maybe a little more old school. You'll find that symphonies like from Mozart will oftentimes repeat the exposition. Later on in the Romantic period, you don't find that as much, as well as some conductors just get rid of the repeats when they perform a piece, when they were originally scored in there. There is no limit to the number of themes or thematic material that can be in each individual group. There might be many themes that are in one group in that key. There also might be only one theme, known as monothematic, something Haydn often did. But this was at the very beginning of the sonata stages. Composers later did a lot of things to make it more interesting. And you'll see that throughout this video, this is going to lay out a foundation of what sonata form is, and you'll see that throughout history, it slowly got evolved. The first group will always be in the home tonic key, and the second group will always be in the contrasting key, though sometimes they do not contrast, but this is atypical. It is one of the trademarks of the sonata form to have these contrasting keys, though some may disagree. Some consider this three-form structure with just an exposition, development, and recapitulation to be in itself the sonata form, where you don't necessarily have to have two groups or have them contrasting, but again, this is the basic formula. And from here you can get an idea of how it evolved and changed through history. So you can be at a similar perspective of the composers who were making changes to the sonata form, who knew the original sonata form, how it worked, and what listeners would expect, and with that they could diverse from that, throw in unexpected moments, and more. In major, usually group 1 is in the tonic key and group 2 is in the dominant key, and in minor, usually group 1 is in the tonic key, and group 2 is in the dominant key, or can be in the relative major. Other than having contrasting key centers, the two groups will usually also have contrasting moods and or themes. Again, this is not a necessity, but it will add to the drama of the piece, whether that's something you want to do or not. In order to get from group 1 to group 2, there's usually a transition. This is usually its own passage, a transitionary passage. This allows there to be a bridge formed between the two contrasting keys, smoothly bringing you from one group and key to the next group and key. This transitionary period could be its own rememberable passage in the piece. So think of it as a modulatory bridge that along the way could do some interesting things, along with being its own fresh material. This could come in handy later on. So other than this basic foundation, there is also oftentimes an introduction to everything and a coda. A coda means a conclusion to a statement. It comes from the Latin word cauda, which means a tale. Musically speaking, this is a concluding passage of a movement or a piece. The coda will give you a solid feeling of finality. This might also bring closure to any unanswered questions that might have occurred in the music so far. The exposition often ends with a codetta. This literally means a little coda, as it is French for little tale. This brings a sense of finality without establishing it too strongly, We only want to end this section, not the entire movement. The codetta will have a strong ending in the key of group 2. You could spice this up like Mozart's codetta from the exposition section to the development section in Movement 1 of Symphony No. 40, where he reminds the listener of the first theme within the codetta. The whole entire exposition is often repeated. Again, this is a little more old school. And there's a debate on whether this is necessary or not, but like many things, that probably depends on a lot of circumstances, from the music itself being played to in what setting is this music being played. So if you're trying to recreate, let's say, a Haydn symphony, and you want to recreate that very beginning classical sense of a sonata, then you might repeat the exposition because that is something that would happen in that time period. And once in a while, you'll read the comments of a piece and someone will write a kind of mean comment saying that the conductor skipped out on repeating the exposition. But in today's day and age, people are a lot more open to little changes in the music that still are based on the foundation of what the composer wrote. The development section. This develops and explores the material presented in the exposition. This does not hold such a tight song structure, and instead it acts as more of a free space as it travels and modulates through many different keys, oftentimes completely avoiding the original keys that the themes had in the exposition, sometimes approaching or leading up to an expectation to arriving back to the original key, but never actually doing so. To add to this, during this section, the piece will often be reluctant to settle on any keys at all, but instead going through a journey of modulations and key center. With this, the composer has the freedom to run around. The whole point is to develop the material that has been presented in the exposition, all while the two contrasting groups are debating or arguing with each other musically. There aren't really any actual structured rules for the development section, therefore composers get creative and end up doing many different things from one another. There is one important thing that has to happen at the end, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Compared to a more structured exposition, the development can be a lot more unstructured. It is common during the development section for the themes to be fragmented. This is often known as motives, where you take the smallest section of what could be made up as a pattern that resembles basically on the smallest level, the smallest basical music theme. Like 3 notes that had a characteristic to go up a sixth and then down a third. With these motives, the original theme is broken up into smaller pieces, then these are used to rebuild in new ways from the original material, or are even recombined with the other fragments to create new material out of the original theme. So with this, the listener might actually not recognize that this is fragments of the original theme, but musically it will work because there are these threads that are holding everything together. Then at the end of the development section, we must prepare or bring the piece back to the home tonic for the recapitulation. This is that important thing I was talking about. This will typically be a passage of dominant preparation. Oftentimes a high point of tension or climax, along with maybe some contrasting things. So maybe now the instruments have big differences in their registers. Maybe all the players are coming together to create a dominant tutti chord. So with that, you can see this is typically a period that is driving you to go back home. So as you can see in the exposition, we're starting off in that home key in group 1. We're going to the dominant key in group 2, and then that's where our exposition ends. From the exposition on the dominant key center, then we go into the development section, which I drew like a roller coaster basically, because it's going to be modulating through all these key centers, not really settling on one of them. Then from here, this is where we're reaching that area of dominant preparation. So we're ending the development section on the dominant key center. So then the recapitulation can start on the tonic, which we're going to get to in a second. But in some cases, the composer might include a whole new theme in the development section. This is more of an expansion of the sonata form, which can add some more depth to its structure. Typically, somewhere along the way, there's a cadence to some tertiary key. Tertiary meaning of 3, so the 3 or 6 chord in major. Modern analysis perceives this as the end of the part of the development section that is actually developing. So as your development section is developing through all these modulations and keys, then you have a cadence to the tertiary key center, which then now the rest of the music in this section is then known as the retransition, dramatically taking us from the tertiary key center that we landed on and going all the way back to the dominant key to prepare us for this recapitulation, where we have the tonic key center. This oftentimes builds and elaborates on material that has been presented before. Okay, next, the recapitulation. If this is going a little quick for you, I'm going to have a review of everything at the end, so you don't have to re-watch everything over again, but instead we'll look at a more visual explanation of what's going on, along with throwing in some extra details along the way. So no matter what, it'll be good to watch that because I'm also going to throw in some extra information. Things that may have made this run on a little too long. Okay, so now we know the recapitulation is where we go from the end of the development section in the dominant key center, which prepares us or takes us back to the home key. But to really understand the recapitulation, it's good to understand what this word means. To recapitulate something is to repeat something in a concise form, or in other words, to summarize something. The recapitulation brings back a summarization of the exposition, at least to some extent. And it may not so much as summarize everything, but instead just retell everything in a new way, basically taking the story of the exposition and retelling it in the recapitulation. But there are definitely some changes along with some twists as well. The biggest change being that now the two groups are in the tonic key. The other changes can be subtle things like how the instruments play the same thing or changes in the dynamics. So a lot of these changes are going to be nuances, something that is not the biggest change, but just makes it a little bit different than before. Oftentimes this section does not actually begin with the first theme, but it does begin in the home tonic key. It might go to different keys throughout it, but the beginning and the end are definitely going to be in the home key, and the groups are going to be highlighting a stability, a feeling of being home at this tonic key, instead of being unsettled like we were in the development section. Now we're going from this unsettled development section and we're settling back. Home sweet home is the recapitulation. Also, you don't have to repeat the two groups in their whole forms, but it is more important to repeat all of group 2 because now it's going to be in the home key instead of being in the dominant key, or perhaps the relative major if we're in minor. So now the conflict that has been established in the exposition from the very beginning, from group 1 and group 2, which then further argued in the development section, have now settled. So this is a very effective model because it helps to create a large space for a convincing musical argument, along with keeping everything in a tight song structure. Even though it may have gotten chaotic in the development section, the sonata form as a whole is a tight song structure, where it's very important to have a clear exposition, development, and recapitulation. This song structure that takes initial ideas and moves them through a journey of sound helps this movement or piece to have that glorious appearance of a master work. Later down the road, composers like to throw off the listener's expectations, and a lot more so than someone like Haydn. To do this, they might change the theme that is used, include a false recapitulation in the development section, and even smoothly or covertly transition into the recapitulation where the listener would normally expect a strong and clear perfect cadence, or to really throw off the expectations instead of beginning on the tonic starting on chord 4, which would allow you to not have to recompose anything, because the transitionary phrase or theme that bridges the tonic key to the dominant key is now returned in the recapitulation, but it is changed. So now the transitionary period turns into a transition into the tonic. So because of this, you could use chord 4 as your transitionary period, which takes you into chord 1, a plagal cadence. Of course, this is going against starting in the home key, but it's playing off that because it's starting in a key that wants to bring you to the home key using material that is already familiar as a transition from one key to the next key in our exposition. Even when the entire recapitulation is in the tonic, when composers rework that transitionary passage that's now in the recapitulation, they oftentimes modulate to chord 4 briefly along the way. This can be helpful and can even balance things out because you often have the relationship of 1 to 5, 5 to 1. So you have that dominant to tonic relationship. In other words, you're going up to your next key on your circle of fifths or in your circle of keys. But now when you're highlighting chord 4, now you're going to the next key down the circle of fifths, going in the opposite direction from the 5. So there's that kind of balance there with the key centers. With this, you'll also see that chord 4 is a chord that is often used throughout the sonata form. Whether that's the transitionary period in the original exposition or possibly moments through the development. And again, now in the recapitulation, possibly even at the very beginning, bringing us to that tonic key, or throughout the middle of it, but really highlighting that chord 1 as the home key, so you're having those plagal cadences. And oftentimes in the recapitulation, you find a lot of 5 to 1 cadences as well. This is really reassuring you that we're landing in this home key, that we are in this home key now. So some people find it redundant that at the end of recaps in composers like Beethoven a lot, you have a lot of emphasis on 5 to 1, 5 to 1. It keeps happening over and over. But for the listener, it's really telling them that, okay, not only is this now in the home key, but we're at the very end of this whole journey of harmony and sound. Now at the end of this, there's an optional coda, which supplies an extra tonic emphasis and closure. This can especially be helpful if the composer feels that the development section modulated to a degree where the listener might not be completely sure that this is home in the recap. There are 3 points of interest in the recapitulation. The first would be how the development section leads into the recapitulation, where you lead into the tonic key, oftentimes with that dominant preparation, sometimes creating a high point contrast in registers or a climax. This can be a very dramatic and important emphasized moment. The second would be the transitionary period between groups 1 and 2. Originally in the exposition, this transition took us to the new key, and now it must be rewritten to keep us in the home key or to take us to the home key. And the third, group 2 is now altered, if altered at all. In W.A. Mozart's Symphony No. 40, he originally went from G minor in group 1 to B flat major in group 2 of the exposition. So you can see here he has that minor to relative major relationship. That's what he chose as his contrasting keys in the exposition. Then in the recap, the first group is in G minor, and the second theme is also in G minor. He could have gone to G major for the recap. This is something that's allowed in minor, that your recapitulation of your minor key can now go to your parallel major key. But making it minor now changed the original major melody to now being transposed in a minor mode, which creates a different emotional feeling from the original. Now to talk about the coda. This creates a solid ending to the movement or piece itself. Again, if it's a one movement piece, it'll conclude the whole piece. If this is just a movement in, let's say, a 3 movement piece, this is going to firmly end this movement. Unlike the codetta, the little tail that just ended the exposition section of this movement. There are lots of possibilities, but the point is to conclude the movement and give a strong sense of finality. This will end in the home key and help support that this is the end of the whole movement. Sometimes during the coda, the composer will take themselves away from the tonic, and then that will cause them to have to find a way back to the tonic. One good example of this is Beethoven's recap in the Eroica movement number 1. At the end of the recap, he's in the home key of E flat major. He then goes from D flat major to C major. From there, he has to find his way back home to E flat major. The sonata form is two people having a conversation with different perspectives that are each arguing their individual viewpoints. But instead, this is an argument of music. As one person brings up a viewpoint, this arises a thesis, to which the other person opposes that viewpoint and contradicts it, creating the antithesis. Then these two people develop into a conversation or argument. Of course, those aren't your only two options, but it's basically the gist of having these two opposing sides, where the opposing sides dissect, question, and rebuild the arguments, possibly even doing things like mimicking or mocking one another. You can imagine where one can get creative with this perspective. After a period of development, then the two opposing sides come to a synthesis, the recapitulation, where now the resolved tension of the disagreement is now settled, just like how you have the recapitulation returning to the home key for both of the groups that were originally conflicting in the exposition, and furthermore being developed through the development period. Besides this 3-section song structure, you also have that additional possible intro and coda, along with the possible codetta at the end of the exposition. Here is a more visual interpretation of the sonata form. Now a review before I get into everything else. Just a reminder that this is the most conventional approach right here, where you have your tonic to dominant relationship. It's good learning about this because this is the very basic form in the beginning of what a sonata is. With this, you can understand the nature of what a sonata is, and with this idea, you can come up with some more things that play off this initial foundation. We see that in major, the exposition goes from the tonic key in group 1 to the dominant key in group 2. Then from here, it ends in group 2, either in group 2 or ending in the key of group 2, or having that codetta, which will be an extra emphasis on this key center in group 2, further ending and emphasizing that we're ending in that key. And then from there we go to the development section, where the themes found in each groups of the exposition now develop through a series of modulations and key centers, oftentimes completely avoiding either keys of group 1 or 2, and oftentimes not settling on any key at all, but exploring a series of modulations. Then from there, it often finds itself settling in a tertiary key center, and again, that being a divisible of 3. So with our scale degrees, scale degree 3 or 6. Then from this established resolution of the tertiary key center, now it has to find its way back to the dominant key center, which will prepare us for the recapitulation, where we're going to have both of our groups from the exposition now returning to the recapitulation as our home key, instead of the conflicting keys that we were presented with from the beginning. Now everything is settled and resolved. And again, the recap has more emphasis on completely restating group 2 now in the tonic, to where the original phrase with a conflicting key center is now in the home key, further emphasizing that we are ending in this home key and that this is the end. This frequently has an additional coda at the end of the recap, further emphasizing that we are ending in this home tonic key, really giving closure to this entire movement, along with an intro before the exposition. The introduction is usually at a slower tempo. It is going to set the mood for the piece, possibly hinting at the harmony that's going to be found in the piece. or maybe even hinting at some of the thematic material that we're going to find within the groups of the exposition. Then in minor, it's the same idea with some subtle changes. In the exposition, group 1 is in the tonic key, which then moves to group 2, which is in the dominant key or the relative major. Again, the exposition is going to end in the group 2's key center. Then from here, this will go to the development section, where just like before, this is going to go through a series of modulations, oftentimes avoiding the keys found in the groups 1 and 2 of the exposition, along with not settling on any keys, but just modulating. From here, we have the optional period that helps to end the developing section of the development itself. This is resolving on a tertiary key center. So in minor, that would be 3, which would actually be your relative major. And furthermore, in major, using key 6 would be your relative minor. So just a little bit interesting there. Then from that resolution in this established tertiary key center, we then have to find our way to the dominant key center or maybe the relative major key center. This is ending our development section and emphasizing the transition. This is more likely probably to be found in the dominant key center because it is going to be preparing us for the recapitulation to where we are going to the home key center, which we can either land on the minor chord 1 from where we started, since we started in minor, or we can go back to the parallel major key center, so just the same note but the major 1. And of course with the possible intro, codetta, and coda. So that's the basis of what's going on here. To further expand on this basic idea, here's what would possibly happen in a realistic scenario like an actual piece of music. So in the beginning, we might have an introduction, which is going to prepare us for the exposition. Now the exposition might go something like this. The theme or themes and key center of group 1 come in and establish themselves. From there you need to get to the conflicting key. Here's where the song has section 2. This is a passage that acts as a modulatory bridge that either is a variation of the first theme or completely new material. This then ends on a cadence, which is usually followed by at least a short pause, known as the medial caesura. This helps with the next section, where we're going to be in group 2, to where now group 2 can be heard as a new, fresh start with new material. After that passage of modulation, and now landing into our group 2, here's where we have section 3. It's often a time to relish and celebrate the fact that you just modulated into the new group. Musically saying, we've made it here in a sort of celebratory fashion. After section 3, which is group 2's thematic material and key center being presented and finished, then there's an optional 4th section which then continues elaborating on the key center of group 2. Within these two groups, there can be many themes that will be heard again directly if the exposition does a full repeat, or will be developed in the development section. So let's say we had that additional section 4, some elaboration on the key center of group 2. Now ending the exposition would be section 5, which is known as the ascensional expositional closure. With many different themes in each group, you could technically have any amount of sections over 4 sections, but this gives you a foundation. Even though the exposition usually has contrasting themes, it is not a must-do, and in fact, not having contrasting themes can be especially effective when writing for smaller ensemble, like for chamber music. Unlike the expectation of a symphony to contain sharp contrasts and dramatic moments with lots of tension, at least with the more romantic and modern symphonies. Although chamber music can have moments that are very dramatic and contrasting, sometimes even with impressive levels of dynamics and projection, the typical chamber music is not super loud or dramatic, and usually has more of an elegance to the harmony, melodies, and accompaniment, and also the contrapuntal activity or passages. For example, Gabriel Fauré's Piano Quintet No. 1, Movement 1 contains 2 different groups with different themes, and this is at first, and then a third group or theme enters its way into the movement. Both themes 2 and 3 do not contrast theme 1, but instead build upon what theme 1 has offered us already, further expanding us from one theme into another theme. The result is a beautiful, elegant journey of sound that seems to slowly move around from one group and theme to another, each with its own character and sound to it that seems to agree with each other in what came previously, causing each theme before it to remain as a further support and influence on what is happening at the moment. Many nuances occur as contrapuntal moments within the overall stream of melody that seems to just keep going, slowly changing and expressing new harmonic moments. That's it for the introduction of sonata form. Now you have an idea of the basic level of what sonata form is. You can begin to hear this when you're listening to sonatas, and you can also look out how composers over time slowly developed this idea of what sonata form is and slowly evolved it over time. One thing to pay attention to is the overall ternary form of a sonata form, which is known as an ABA form. So you have section A, which then clearly goes to section B. There's a clear difference, and then that clearly goes back to section A ternary form, and we can see that's basically what we're doing here in the sonata form, just in a much more structured way, which actually allows more of a containment of the ideas and material that the composer is going to first present and then develop and then recapitulate, versus just running wild in section A and then the same thing in section B and just doing a bunch of stuff and then going back to the section A where it's the same thing as section A, but it's not as structured or as simple to where you're just developing these two groups of ideas. So on one level, this is allowing you to create a magnificent journey of sound just based on simple groups and themes. It's also good to point out that it was the common form to use from the classical period and on as the ternary form, but in the Baroque period, they were more accustomed to a binary form, so just an A and a B. And with a binary form, you need to at least repeat one of the sections one time, if not both of them, because if you don't repeat any of the sections, how is anyone going to know that it's group 1 and group 2? If you just have a song going from one moment to the next moment, it's not really going to seem like it went from group 1 or group 2 until you bring group 1 back. Then all of a sudden the listener thinks, okay, I'm hearing group 1 again. That must have been group 2 that I was just listening to. So with this gave arisal to the rounded binary form found in Baroque music, which is where you get the section or the end of the A section, and you just put it at the very end of the B section, giving closure to the B section, but telling us that, okay, we just ended in group 1, making us realize that we were just in group 2, with originally being in group 1. Where you can see the rounded binary form is very similar to the ternary form, to where rounded binary would be AB with a little bit of A, while ternary form is ABA. So with this, we can see that this is a further development on figuring out how to deal with basically like the binary form, evolving it into the rounded binary form. We have the ternary form, and we have the sonata form. You can see how they built off each other. I'm going to leave a link in the description for a cheat sheet of the sonata form that you can download and print. So anytime you can just look at it and have a reminder, or if you're writing a piece, you can look at it and check off the things that make up a sonata form on a basic level. Along with a link to a video from another channel where you'll get a lot more of the history of the sonata form, along with its developments throughout history, and takes a more critical approach and also discusses how this base mold of having two different groups with conflicting keys is not exactly what a sonata is, But a sonata has to do more with how the song is structured, with the clear exposition, development, and recapitulation. Then be sure to check out my video on the sonata. And from the sonata, I discuss one of the possible forms found in a separate video. So look out for the minuet and trio video, as well as an evolution from the minuet and trio. Look out for the scherzo video. With all this, you're going to get a foundational idea of the sonata form in its roots, how it started, how it was constructed in the beginning, and then how it slowly evolved through time, enabling the composer to be able to create many different sounding periods of music, along with having a vast knowledge of what they're able to do within the sonata. Okay, so that's it for this video, Sonata Form. Subscribe if you want to see more videos, and be sure to check out my music playlists, along with the other videos on my channel, to where now I have over 140 videos posted. Thanks for watching, and until next time, goodbye.